It's a wonderful good day, everybody, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're doing something that I haven't been doing for almost 2 years, but since I'm now back in Modern and back in the meta for more than 3 months, I thought it would be time to have a look at the Modern Metagame of 2022, and by that I of course mean Modern after the lowest ban in March or late February. So today we're going to have a look at the Modern Metagame as a whole, how much metagame share each deck has, and then we're going to look at win percentages and metagame share, which constitutes the Modern tier list, so the relative strength of each Modern deck in comparison to one another. And then last but not least, we're also going to go over the Modern matchup metrics, which means where the strengths and weaknesses of the best performing decks in Modern lie. So jumping right in with the first topic, just a quick reminder here. Wizards of the Coast stated on June 7th in their latest banned and restricted announcement, the Modern metagame continues to show great playstyle diversity with aggro, tempo, combo, control, and ramp all represented in the 10 most played decks. The most played deck, Is It Murktide, represents about 10% of the Magic Online metagame and hovers right around the 50% win rate. The top decks show strengths and weaknesses against each other, and there looks to be plenty of room for less popular rogue decks to be successful. So, this means that Modern overall seems healthy, right? So let's have a look at the current Modern metagame and whether or not we can verify or debunk that statement. What always bothers me with Wizards of the Coast is that they're restrictive in regards to metagame data or data in general that they have access to through MTGO, through paper and tabletop tournaments, and we always just see what they want us to see, right? We get top 8 or top 32 of a couple of Modern challenges. We get a curated list of 5-0 deck lists every couple of weeks, but you know, drawing conclusions from that is very, very difficult. And so we're basically left to ourselves to compile the data. I've thankfully found a website where that actually happens, well, on a somewhat professional level, it seemed. I was rather happy with it. I'll also link it in the video's description. But yeah, out of that metagame data, I compiled this pie chart here. So let's go over what we're seeing, and then I'll add some comments to the highlighted tiles here. So overall, we're starting out with the biggest category that is still comprised of other in Modern, which means that there's still a lot of rogue decks, as Wizard stated, in Modern around, and that is all good and fine. But looking at the top 10 lists here, we have Is It Murktide at 12%, by far the most popular deck, as it appears to be. Then we have 4C Blink or 4C Elementals, or whatever you want to call it. There are some variations amongst it. Some play counterspell, some play more creatures, some play ephemerate, but overall the baseline of the deck is 100% the same. It's all Ren 6, Teferi, Omnath, and Yorion, and 80 cards. And then there's Burn, Amulet Titan, Hammer Time, Rhino, and Living End, all around the 5% mark. Burn, of course, a very user-friendly and entry-level deck that is not super cheap, but comparatively cheap. Also, you can build it on a budget basis if you want to leave out Sunbed Canyons, etc. So Burn most of the time is overrepresented and underperforms, but it happens to have a very good matchup against 4C, and therefore I'm actually quite thankful for it being in the meta and also being represented quite well. Then there's Amulet Titan, which has been a mainstay around the 5% mark for as long as I can remember in Modern, in various iterations, of course. Some people claim that it's a very difficult deck to play, and there's certainly some complexity there, but the lines are all pretty obvious. It's like chess, you know. Yeah, initially you might have to go through a couple of run-throughs to get it straight, but afterwards the lines are pretty straightforward, I think. Then there's hammer time, which I would constitute as an, yeah, well, it's a combo deck, basically the same as Rhinos and Living End. Then there's Jagdmoth, which is also a combo deck, but a creature-based combo deck. And then we have a couple of control elements. So overall, I would agree with Wizards of the Coast. We have Izzet Murktide as tempo. We have control elements. We have, if you consider Amulet Titan a ramp deck, then we have ramp as well in the top 10 played decks. So overall, I think Wizards of the Coast made a correct statement, or one that I could agree with. And what we see here is also what I experienced throughout most of my leagues, right? These are the most common decks that you will see in my videos as, my opponents. And that's also what is dominating the challenges for the most part. So now you can also see a couple of highlighted tiles here. So first of all, I'd like to talk about the 4C tiles, which are marked in green here. Because there is a differentiation going on between different versions of 4C, but they all have 80 cards and the same basis as I just explained. So for me, this differentiation is actually meaningless, and also, biases the data away from 4C. I don't know if this is intentional, but I've seen many people do it. And I think these should be lumped together to just 4C good stuff piles. And then we're around 11% alongside Izzet Murktide. So the second most popular deck by far. And then we'll have a look at the win percentages in the next step. But the same goes for blue-white control here at around 5% altogether. Sometimes these lists run a Jeskai Triumph to accommodate 4 copies of Fire Ice or any copy of Fire Ice. So these decks can run red to a certain degree, but they mostly have 1 or 2 sources in there. So it's very much a stretch to call those Jeskai control, and therefore most of these Jeskai control decks here are mislabeled blue-white control decks, although there are also some Jeskai control decks, of course, running around, but certainly not enough to make the top 20 decks cut here. All right, so that's that for the metagame. Also, just a comment here, I think overall the statement that Grixis Death Shadow is at 3% is correct, but since this pile of data has been compiled throughout the last 3 months, right after the Lotus ban, Grixis Death Shadow has been, almost dead, and now with new Capana and Ledger Shredder, the numbers have increased significantly. I would say that Grixis Shadow is definitely higher than 3% right now. I would put it around 5 to 6% of the meta in the current metagame. All right, moving on to the next topic here today is the modern tier list. Tier 1 does contain 3 decks currently, Living End, Izzet Murktide, and Blink. So these tier lists aren't coming from me. These are not my personal opinion. Again, it's coming from MtgMeta.io or something like that. I will link it. And it is data driven, right? So the function here is a combination of win rate and metagame share, which I think is correct. Because you cannot take it out of context, right? The more metagame share a deck has, the lower the win rate should be, because, of course, against itself, it always has a 50% win rate, and therefore that evens it out to a certain degree. Nonetheless, we have to consider the fact that Izzet Murktide, the only deck that Wizards of the Coast was talking about, is around 50% win rates, with a metagame share of around 12%, but the other 2 decks here in Tier 1, Living End and Blink, or 4C, are around 55 and 58% respectively. 55 and 58% against the meta as a whole is actually rather insane. I also want to add the tier 2 list here already, because we can see the elementals being listed at 3.59%, exactly the same as in the pile chart, of course. So together, they're averaging around 59, 58%, somewhere in between there, and have a metagame share of over 11%. So now one can see, looking at the data here, that some might see 4C elementals or 4C control being a problematic deck, because it does have an insanely high win rate against the meta as a whole. And moreover, as we will see in the next section of my presentation here, elemental is actually pretty good against all the other top decks. So you're not only really punishing creature decks, etc., but you're also really good against the other tier 1 decks. But otherwise, we see that Hammer Time, Amulet, and Azorius control, so the a little bit older decks that haven't received as many new cards as the rest of the decks listed here lately. Of course, they all, got stronger and therefore were able to maintain their meta share. But these decks are all around 50%, right? Very healthy, very good for the meta, with lots of weaknesses and strengths to exploit and to play to. Whereas Rhinos and Yawgmoth, the other two decks that have benefited a lot, Grist, Boseiju on Yawgmoth's side, and Rhinos also with subtlety lately. Of course, is also playing Force Negation, etc. So these decks are 56% and 57% respectively as well. So overall, having a pretty bipolar meta, I would say, with a couple of decks that are significantly ahead of the rest of the metagame here. That's basically the takeaway. So to dive a little bit deeper into how they compare to each other, I wanted to have a look at the modern matchup metrics, right? And we're looking at the top 5 decks in terms of their win percentages against the meta. So on the left-hand side, you can see which decks we're talking about. So Elementals and Blink, you always can consider one deck. Then there's Rhinos, Yawgmoth, and Living End. Exactly the decks that we're just talking about. Also, in my personal opinion, I would put Yawgmoth into the tier 1 list, either next to or over Is It Murktide. But the couple of takeaways that I wanted to talk about here, looking at the matchups of Rhinos and Living End against Azorius Control specifically, while Yawgmoth and 4C have a very favorable matchup against Azorius Control, Rhinos and Living End both have a bad matchup. And that is, of course, because these decks are running Supreme Verdict and Teferi, both of which are very good foils against Living End and Crashing Footfalls. Very efficient ones that cannot be countered by Force of Negation, which is, of course, the premier way for these decks to interact with their opponent that, want to get rid of the early board presence that these two decks can provide. So if you're running in a meta with a lot of Living End and Rhinos, definitely try to incorporate these two cards into your deck. There are Esper versions if you don't want to go that route of 2 colors. There's, of course, Jeskai as well. But that's definitely something that you can do. So other than that, we can also see here in the column 4 that Blink actually has a very good matchup against Rhinos, Yawgmoth, and Living End. And this is something to consider, right? So not only does this deck beat up on a lot of other strategies as well, but also it does have a very favorable matchup against the other top decks, namely Rhinos, Yawgmoth, and Living End. And also, of course, Is It Murktide, right? So here, Blink against Is It Murktide has almost 60% as well. So that is already a metagame share of 25 to 30% that just are very, very favorable on the top end of the spectrum, and then anything that's less efficient than you are, so basically, all the dirty decks, control or go white creatures or whatever, you also beat just along the way. So that is very, very important as well, and that's also why I consider the 4C lists to be potentially problematic, and also why I question WotC's statement that Modern doesn't have any issues, and why they're just looking at, is it Murktide, when that's the least of our problems, right? So the third takeaway here is, what you can see here in these two columns, Jeskai control and Junt mid-range, right? Across the board, these two decks actually have very good matchups, around 50% or better, against all the top decks in the format. And here I have to add a comment, because Jeskai control is not what you typically think of. This Jeskai control list is the Jeskai Lotus Field list, right? With Blood Sun, with 4 Teferi's Hero of the Mineria, with 4 Memory Deluge, with Chalice of the Void, right? So a deck that sacrifices early game interaction for late game power. And that's, of course, very, very potent against 4C elementals as well, because it shuts down, for instance, fetch lands, it shuts down Cavern of Souls, etc. And then your corner spells alive, you can stop Random 6 to a certain degree, you have Chalice of the Void for the 1 mana spells, etc. So it's just a very good deck, apparently, across the top of the field. So if you're trying to really metagame your local competition, or even at bigger events, and you're a very well-versed Jeskai control pilot, then maybe you want to go that route. Looks very interesting. Maybe I'm going to try to pull together a video at some point as well. But generally speaking, Jeskai is not my personal preference. As is Junt midrange. So lately, Junt has been dead 100 times already, but the Goyf always comes back. And that's also what we've seen lately, namely in this last June competition, where there were multiple Junt lists, both in the DreamHack competition, which had a couple of 100 participants, as well as the online challenges, which have seen some Junt lists rise to the top in between as well. So Junt midrange always considers both Boomer Junt, which means the typical one with Blood-Red Elf and Lilianas, and then there is the other version with Ragavan, with Urza Saga, etc. That's a little bit more land-focused or land-centric. But just wanted to point out that these two decks appear to have very decent matchups against the top decks here. Yeah, so that's it for today. I think the only thing that I want to add is that I think the metagame is very healthy and enjoyable right now, right? So I would agree with Wizards of the Coast not necessarily taking action and banning anything, especially because there are now coming up a couple of bigger events with the return of the Pro Tour and the return of regional championships, etc. So maybe they just want to see the modern metagame settle down for a bit, and have people actually purchase new paper decks, get their decks updated, so that they can compete in the metagame and not be shaken by another ban right away. But in the future, I think that 4C decks will have to take a hit, and I also think that Violent Outburst specifically isn't really healthy for the format. There's also already combinations of the Violent Outburst decks and the Elemental decks, namely Glimpse of Tomorrow, Cascade, which basically is an elemental deck that, you know, can cycle through a Glimpse of Tomorrow and generate card advantage that way. Also very difficult to deal with. And I think all of that is completely fine if it's at Soul 3 speed. It's just really problematic in the metagame for anything that wants to interact with it if these combo decks can always turn 3 combo with Force Negation and Subtlety backup. And even other free interaction like Reef for the benefit as well. Yeah, but as I said, I think the Modern Metagame is completely fine right now, enjoyable, and then in the future we will have to see whether or not Ren 6 can stay. The only really big omission that Modern is lacking right now from my perspective is that there are no go-wide creature synergies, right? There's no humans, there's no merfolk, there's no death and taxes, nothing of that. And that's, of course, on the one hand, due to Ren 6, I cannot overstate how important Ren 6 is. Just casually being in all these mid-range and control decks and checking early interaction synergies between creatures, right? And then on the other hand, there's also the top end, which is Fury, right? So a lot of these lists are now packing Fury. I don't think that Fury itself is an issue. I think that the combination of a card that checks the early game, generates card advantage, and then provides the lands to play an on-curve Fury, potentially even without having to pitch it for card disadvantage, that combination is an issue. Having played a lot of Death and Taxes myself throughout the last couple of months, that is always what I was scared of the most or disliked the most, and that's just a turn 2. Like on the draw, it's even worse, right? Turn 2 to Ren 6 on the draw, but a Ren 6 into like ditching an additional copy of Ren 6 to a Fury is just not beatable for most creature decks. But that's it from my side, from my perspective. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you guys around.